Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we have covered some very deadly dates on the channel over the last 4 years. From just the American point of view alone, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Peleliu, and other days of tragedy. But to explain that October the 24th, 1944 was no average day for the USA's award-winning author, Rona Simmons. Her book is in the links below. Here's my copy here, but you can find it at your local bookstore. But there is a link to purchase it down in the links there. So I'll bring her in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So we were just chatting before going live there about the people we deal, the circles we move in, and historians and writing, and the different angles which there are you can convey history. So how do you like to define yourself? Storyteller, historian, researcher, academic? What's the label you like?
Well, I could probably say pseudo historian, because I just after 4 books, people started calling me a historian, and I was really shocked when I first heard that applied to my name, because I never considered myself to be a historian, more of a storyteller from an author's point of view. And I also, when my second book came out, The Other Veterans of World War II, I realized what I was I was the legacy generation, because there was Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, and I considered myself, since my father was in World War II, to have that legacy, and went from there to try to make sure that I was honoring him as well as the other soldiers who fought in World War II.
Well, thank you for that. And we are in this interesting era where we are bridging. We're bridging the veterans being around, and even children who are around in the war. They are passing away now. We're not far away from no one left who was living during those war years, which is amazing. Because I mean, when I was a young man, my first football coach was a World War II veteran. It just seemed normal back 40 years ago, but now the end is coming ever closer. But we're going to be talking about this day in 44. And obviously, during the talk, we'll talk about how you came to this story and the significance of it. But we'll bring up your slides. And folks, what we'll do today in terms of questions is, if there are any big questions about the work Rona does, or large questions about World War II, generally we'll do them at the end. But specific questions about the details as we go through, feel free to fire them away as we go along. I'll hand over to my guest to take us through the events of 80 years and 7 weeks ago or something.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. If we can go on to the next slide, if you will, Paul. I really like to start with where I started when I was bridging between books, and knowing that so much, I say it's not countless books, it's countless bookshelves, it's countless bookstores of World War II books. So trying to find something new to talk about. Everybody knew about Pearl Harbor, everybody knows about D-Day, and I didn't think that I could think of anything to add to those books. And so I really started looking at newspapers, my favorite source of mine. And I went to smaller town newspapers here in the United States. I found the newspapers would talk about their local heroes. Yeah. And they weren't heroes when they left for the war. You would find a list of 10 people from a very small town who were about to be deployed, who were accepted into the military, who were leaving the next week, who came home. They would talk about them visiting their home before they left for the war. And then as the war progressed, I'd find stories more like this one in the middle, where the town had kept records, and they'd say 30 men from the town have been perished, or 100 men have perished. And that's what intrigued me, is this understanding of the war through the people. And I always say, not the admirals and generals, but the man on the street, the person like you or me. And I could better identify with what it meant at that time to go to war. And I tripped on this story in one of the papers, and then went and followed it up on the internet, and found a story of a person my age who was trying to find his uncle, who had crashed in a plane crash in the Pacific. And he knew it was a couple of different islands. He wasn't exactly sure. It was maybe 30 years ago. And so he was traveling out there, going from island to island, talking to the locals, getting a better idea, sort of narrowing it down. And he was on Yap Island. Now, I had to be the first to admit I had no idea where Yap Island was. So I, of course, got my maps out and started looking. And this gentleman, his name is Pat Renfrens, was talking to the islanders. And they said, well, we don't think your father was here, but there was a grave, and it was at the end of the old airstrip. And so they took him out there, and they showed him a grave that turned out to be First Lieutenant Gervis Haltom from the Marine Corps. And he had been in Peleliu, stationed there, flying with the Marines, just a couple of weeks, couple months. And then they started saying, well, we need you to check out Yap Island, make sure that the airfields there have been demolished and are not serviceable. So he was flying out there. They went on a mission. So 2 or 3 planes. They flew over the airstrip. It had been bombed a week earlier just to check. And there were wrecks of airplanes at the sides. And so, unfortunately, like all naive young men, he decides, well, I'll come back around for just another pass, just to check. And Gervis made a circle back. And of course, at that time, they opened up. And his plane crashed and at the end of the runway. The islanders actually took his body and buried it. And at the end of the war, 1947, them in the early stages of trying to reclaim our dead, they did find Gervis Haltom's grave. But this was some 30 years after the war when Pat Renfrens is there. And they told him the story of having tended his grave, and they could still find where the grave had been, and the jungle had been carefully kept back from overcoming this grave. And that, when I heard that fascinating story, and that's not the only one where the natives or islanders or local citizens of whatever country honored the graves of some of our citizens. That fascinated me and really led me into this process. So if you could go to the next slide. So that was interesting, and so I knew I was going to write about people, but what people were, and that's when I also thought, rather than doing a battle or the story of a country, that I would try to cover the war globally, because it is a global war, and we haven't had one of those, thankfully, in so many years. I thought if I could find a date where that would cover the entire war, and of course that meant it had to be later in the war, and started landing on 1944. I picked that as a year and began looking at what happened then. And of course then the newspapers are all about the Philippines and the island hopping. And I began researching. One thing I do is I do work for a group that is called Stories Behind the Stars, and we are we are profiling all 400,000 American fallen from the war. I've done about 350 of these stories now, so it's a massive undertaking. And in total, we have volunteers from all over the globe, 150 people who are writing stories. And when I was looking at one or two, the date October 24th came up. So I wrote their story, and then it came up again and again. And I thought, well, this is an odd date. It's nothing I really know about. So I then dug in and found actually story after story. And one particular incident was the Arasai Maru, which we'll talk about in more depth. But it was a matter of finding these different people, which became actually quite easy after a while, to look at various cemeteries or records, missing aircraft reports of individual incidents, and they began piling up. And when I had that idea, I thought, what if I could tell this story hour by hour? And so that's what I did. Now, at the time I started, I didn't realize what I had decided to do. It was about halfway through when I realized what I was going to do was, if I was going to tell these stories across the clock, that meant I was going to delve into practically every major incident, every major battle that was going on. And so the research just ballooned, as someone much smarter than me could have told me when I started out. But it became fascinating, and I learned so much. And so I want to share a little bit about that with you, if you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and just want to add the fact that that's a fantastic, interesting way of approaching it, because one of the things we're often talking about this channel is how you measure things. How do you measure like the success or failure? How do you measure a unit's competency? Are they elite? Are they green? Are they hopeless? And that point of view of starting from the newspapers. I remember a show we did with Autumn Hendrickson a year or so ago about studying her hometown, is that hometown newspapers aren't looking for the biggest story. They're looking for the one that is most relevant to their readership. Well, who's from that town, from that county. And so, look, I don't know that anybody's looked at a date before in terms of a global point of view. People have honed in on dates from the point of view of, as we mentioned, something like D-Day or Pearl Harbor or one of the key events, but not globally. It's a really fascinating approach, and I can't wait to hear what you're going to say. So I'm going to shut up and let you carry on.
Oh no, that's okay. It was, at the start, I don't know that I really thought about trying to find the day when more people were killed than others. It was a matter of finding something where the entire globe was involved.
There's a thread, yeah.
But then when I discovered this date, and it was interesting because James Hornfisher's book, Last Stand of the Tin Can Soldiers, is about October 25th. And it puzzled me why he did that, other than, of course, it was the strictly a naval battle. And when I found these incidents, and they kept piling up, and then about midway through, I said, well, just how many people did die on this day? And that's when I began my little tick sheet, and I had day after day after day. And I discovered that I think there were 2,403 people at Pearl Harbor or D-Day, and 25 odd in D-Day. And the numbers started adding up to 2,600. And I said, oh my gosh, I had no idea. And I began asking other people if they even knew about this date. And no one seemed to, so that cemented it. But the first person you can see around the globe that was perished, and I mean, I have to admit, it's a lot easier to find the actual moment of a naval Coast Guard person's death than it is Army or even Air Force, because of ship's logs. And the torpedo was fired at 12:02 a.m. Or they took a hit at 3:15 p.m. So that was a lot easier. And in a couple of places, especially when it was in the Army, you might know a battle began about dawn, and then it went till the late hours. So you had to kind of interpolate in between there for some of the Army people who died completely out of sight of anyone. And they could have been there a day, not a day, but for hours. So in about half dozen of the stories, I had to kind of arbitrarily assign a date.
And just quickly, how did you resolve the time zone conundrum?
Well, that was a very, very difficult thing. I decided that I was going to tell it at 6 a.m. in the Pacific was the same moment as 6 a.m. in France, as 6 a.m. in Asia, because I wanted that to be a complete day. It was everybody's 6 a.m., everybody's noon, everybody's midnight. And I really did about as much research on finding the actual date as I did finding the people's stories. It was in a number of instances involved a lot of pulling strings and following them before you could find the information. But by and large, it's fairly accurate, with the exception, like I said, where a couple I decided to start with Paul Miller. He was the first one, and he was in a prison camp in Japan. And of course, working in the mines, which was a terrible duty and very trying. And there was a date, because the Japanese did report after the fact, when sometimes during the war, but mostly after the fact, we got a lot of records that said what day someone perished. And he did die of beriberi in the prison. And I decided, I want him to lead the way, because I don't want him to work one more day than he had to in that mine. So I had him go first. But from there, it progressed, and again around the globe. To the very last one, one interesting side of aspect there was the story of the USS Tang, which many people may know about. It's now an exhibit at the National Museum in World War II in New Orleans, because the Tang, when it fired its torpedoes, during a battle in the Pacific, it had its last torpedo went out, porpoised, or surfaced, and made a full 360-degree turn and came back and sank the Tang. And for me, all 87 people on that ship would have been a wonderful story to be able to tell. But it happened at 12:03 a.m. on the 25th. And I spent countless days, because I wanted that story in this book, and speaking with the museum research people at the Museum of the Pacific War here in the States. And they said, well, you have to rely on the ship's log. And I said, but it was 12:03. How do you know that it wasn't 12:01 or 11:59? I mean, and he said, it was 12:03. Sorry. So that story is not in my book. And I ended it with the last couple of deaths at 11:56 on the 24th. But we'll talk about a few of these people, because I think a lot of the questions I get are, how did you pick them? Because there were 2,600 stories.
Yeah.
2,615. And I always say, I think they picked me as opposed to my picking them. Their stories, I wanted to be as unusual and as different one from the other as I could, and find some fascinating aspects. So if you'll move to the next slide.
Yeah.
Now here are just a few. I told you about Gervis Haltom already, but there was then First Lieutenant Herman Adolphe, and he was flying. He had actually joined the Canadian Air Force. So many men, like my father, were, I say, bitten by the flying bug. They wanted to be pilots more than anything. And so he was afraid that America was not going to get into the war, and he was going to miss his chance to fly. So when Canada entered the war, he crossed the border and got into the RCAF, flew with them, and they transferred him over to England, and he was flying from there into the continent, C-47 delivering supplies. Well, then D-Day happened. He was over there, and he said, I have to join my compatriots. So he applied for a transfer and was given that ability to continue with the U.S. Air Force, flying out of England. And he, at that point, C-47s. And he was on a mission on the October 24th. He with two other planes, they flew over Dunkirk, and the city was still involved in a major battle with the Germans. And they were supposed to skirt Dunkirk, but as he said, or the reports afterwards were that they were off like 3 degrees from their path, and 3 degrees became 4 degrees, became 5 degrees, and the next thing they were flying over Dunkirk and were shot down. And the interesting story, his plane actually landed in front of the submarine pens, the German submarine pens out off of Dunkirk. So the Germans needed to clear that plane from the water so that they could actually enter and exit the submarine pens. And they ended up not being able to do that. There were 3 of the men came to the surface and they were buried. And they ended up blowing up the plane, and using detonation to clear the harbor. So his body was not recovered. And the one interesting aspect here, because I try every time I can to find their descendants, and I was able to find Herman Adolphe's son and have conversations. Well, he sent me the Defense Department's, the DPAA, as it's now known, the Defense POWMIA accounting agency. And they are alive and well today, still recovering, investigating World War II and after circumstances around the globe to try to recover bodies. They went to Dunkirk and the surroundings. They found an eyewitness to this crash, and that witness told them that they had been able to bury his 3 crewmen that went with him, but that his body was not recovered. And they did take the DPAA to the actual location of the graves, and they brought those gentlemen's remains home. But his Herman Adolphe as with his plane. They did find one piece of metal that they could identify was positively his plane. So that one was a special story because I was able to connect, and there were about another half dozen that I found descendants, and that makes the stories come alive so much more.
I'm assuming that family members would not have made the connection that this was a particularly costly day, because it doesn't affect you as a family member how many other people were killed that day. All that affects you is the loss of your brother, your son, your husband, or indeed wife or mother. So I'm assuming that, it was surprised when you contacted me. I hadn't registered at that day. I knew things had happened on that day, but I hadn't realized that globally it was significant. So the family members can't have realized at all.
No, especially in these cases where one plane went down, or one soldier was killed, or was an accident. I don't think, other than the people from the RSM Maru or the Princeton and Birmingham, which are the two major incidents of this day. Another one, which a lot of people know about, was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Lost Battalion. I think there's a Lost Battalion or Lost Battalions, plural, in just about any war. And this one was, I picked Staff Sergeant Shirotogo, was one of the Japanese Americans who had volunteered to fight. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize that, even though we incarcerated a number of the Japanese Americans who were on our shores early in the war, that so many of them said, this is my country. I'm not going to sit out this war in a prison camp. I'm going to enlist. And they did. And I think they became almost more determined than other ethnic groups to show what they could do. And the story here is that the 141st, 2nd and 3rd Infantry were sent in the battle in France and Belgium area. And one of them were tasked, they had to straighten their lines, go up the mountain, take the mountain, and they became cut off from the rest of their battalion. They went up thinking that it was a one-day battle or a one-day skirmish. They had whatever food they had on their back and whatever ammunition they had, certainly nothing extensive, until they found themselves cut off. And they tried a number of times to escape from the perimeter they set up. They tried to carry wounded back, and each time the litter bearers would make it 100 yards and turn around and come back with the wounded, because they were not able to break through. We tried to parachute ammunition to them, food to them, water, and oftentimes the Germans were the first to catch the food, or to capture the parachute drops of food and ammunition. So finally, they were called in the 442nd, which was fighting with them, but wasn't yet on the mountain. And they had earned the reputation, their motto was "Go for broke." And they had proved themselves a couple times in being the unit to penetrate more quickly. And so the 442nd went in, and tremendous casualties. I think they lost 800 men, either went wounded or killed. And Shirotogo is one of them. After the war, it actually became somewhat more of a controversy because the men were not recognized like many people said they ought to have been, because the theory was they were Japanese, and questions were raised. Why did this particular group, besides its fierce reputation, why were they sent in? And there were accusations it was because they were Japanese Americans and they were more expendable. Well, it took till Bill Clinton was president until they were awarded a couple of medals of honor, and gold stars were awarded to them. So they got their recognition, unfortunately, very, very late. Another story I like to tell, also very different, was George McElroy. This one is, there were a number of, in the book, which astonished me, of people being killed in the U.S. Through accidents or fights or battles on our shores. But George McElroy was from Mason City, Iowa, and he joined the Navy. He had been in World War I, and he said, "I just can't sit out." And he rejoined. He was assigned to the USS Roe in the Pacific, and they were had left Pearl Harbor in September, late September, October. And they were again heading back out. They were getting assignments to go into, at that time, was dangerous waters. And they were making a stop in Adak, Alaska. About the worst assignment anybody could get, worst place, I think. And they were passing through Adak, made a stop there. And it's not known, but for some reason, George was transferred from the USS Roe to the station at Adak, the naval station there. And the ship went on. And survived. There wasn't anything necessarily dramatic about what happened to the Roe. But George had been a newspaper journalist in his hometown in Mason City, Iowa. And he lands on Adak, and I had no idea, but he found Dashiell Hammett in Adak, Alaska. And Dashiell Hammett was the editor of the local newspaper. Now, it's like a 3-page newspaper, but he was the head of the newspaper. And I could only imagine that for a newspaper man to find himself being able to be an understudy to Dashiell Hammett must have been the thrill of a lifetime. Unfortunately, his life was very, very short. On October 24th, he had a heart attack and died. So it was ended, and his hometown newspaper had reported him being on Adak, had reported some of his earliest stories, and then reported his obituary. And that again ties you back to those newspapers, because they're invaluable to find these stories.
And I'm really appreciative when I looked at the book that it's not just people killed in combat, because one of the terrible things about the number of people involved is that people are going to be dying of all sorts of things. They get run over by vehicles. There are heart attacks. Disease alone killed thousands of soldiers in World War II. And so we have this kind of movie image of, if someone dies, the best way, quote unquote, to die for your country is to be running up that hill with a bayonet on your rifle, kill 3 or 4 enemy soldiers, earn the Silver Star or the Military Cross, whichever nation you serve for, and kind of be carried down the hill by your comrades on your shoulders, and everybody gathers to bid you farewell. And that's an idealized version of it. Idealized is an odd word to use there, but that's not the reality for so many people. One of the questions I was asked a lot is why the families weren't given very much information about the circumstances of their loved one's death. Is it because sometimes it was just awful? Sometimes it was just, standing around and a random bomb fell off the back of a truck and people were killed. So people don't want to hear that their dad was killed in an accident. It's a good reminder that death came in all shapes and forms in World War II, tragically.
Absolutely. I think one of the stories I tell are of the pilots in the U.S. who were taking off for practice runs, right before they were ready to be deployed. And on October 24th, there were 3 crashes that morning. And in each one, 11 men killed, perished, gone. And the next week, they would have been deployed to, in this case, likely the Pacific. And the fact that they got on those planes, and had they read the news or had news available to them that was current, they would have found out there were 3 or 4 other accidents where their same planes were shot down or crashed in foreign countries. And yet, they were young, 18, bulletproof 20-year-olds, and nothing could happen to them, and it did. And it was very tragic. And the families, when they did get the news, would have said, I would rather have been carried on the shoulders of his comrades and done something. And when we do these stories even today, I think, well, to me, someone who signed up, went through the training, went through boot camp, went through everything they needed to do, and whether it was 6 months before being deployed or a day before being deployed, they deserve as much respect as the men who made the voyage to overseas and were killed. And
I hate to interrupt again, but one of my great friends, Don Baguette, who wrote Courier, he is Screaming Eagle in Normandy, he was A Company 506 paratrooper in Normandy, and he chastised me once. We were walking into American Cemetery in Omaha Beach at some point, and I was talking and he was listening, and he said, "Did you just say that some of the men here gave their lives?" And I said, I think I did. I may have said, they said, no, they didn't. He said, they gave their service and their lives were violently taken away from them.
Right. Exactly.
And since I heard that, I've tried to adjust my language, because you do get, of course, there are cases of people absolutely supremely sacrificing themselves for their friends. The kind of the cliche of jumping on a grenade or staying on board a ship and sealing the door behind you so that that your friends will escape but you will go down in the big compartment. But most people who die, it's just a violent act. They're alive 1 minute trying to do their job, and the next second they're dead, and there's no giving of their life. They're trying to live, and I think that's an important classification. I'm glad you're reminding us that again, people's lives can be taken in a whole variety of ways.
Absolutely, yeah. And it goes, even today you hear, well, they were killed in action, and someone else is missing in action. Well, I'm sorry, today they were killed in action. Just because we couldn't find them at that moment, they got a different classification, which is often overlooked in the numbers as well. Just two more examples here. In George Washington, his name George Washington Pittman, which when I found names like that, I knew, okay, this guy has to be told his story. I mean, there were John Pershing Smiths and Benjamin Franklin Smiths and George Washington Pittman. And I thought, how did these people go to war with those names? And maybe they just said, my name's George Pittman, and they overlooked their middle name. But I always tried to find their middle name, and I thought it was fascinating. Here is a very young seaman who, from a tiny, tiny town in North Carolina, and he had, I think, if I recall, 6 or 7 siblings. And so he was one of the older ones and set the example. And from a very poor background, they were tobacco farmers. I think if he had a 6th grade education, I'd be surprised. And he goes into the Navy and is deployed on a submarine and is the cook, as many black men were in those roles in the Navy, and certainly Army and Air Force as well, under the lower ranks. But he was so proud and had done such a good job. He had several promotions. He was, by this point in time, the cook 2nd class in October 44. And this was the USS Shark was lost at sea. I'll leave it at that point. I don't want to give too much of the book away, at least at this point. But he, along with everyone on board, perished in the Pacific. And you know that in the height of the battle, even in a submarine, which you can't escape too far, he was in the bowels of the ship and saw nothing, knew nothing about what was going on, unless the captain, of course, would have said, going to general quarters if that was the case. And so they would have done put away their pots and pans and done what they could to secure the galley, and then maybe performed something that he was tasked with when they went to general quarters. But here are people who I'm always fascinated by the Navy, because they're in so many men in the ship that can do nothing, have no say. It's like if you were a part of the Army, even in a skirmish, you think there's more you can do. Well, for George Washington Pittman, there was nothing more he could do than stand his ground in whatever role he was given. And the final sort of odd example I'll give, because I've always tried to find women, and in battle, and or involved in some fashion in the war, because we tend to forget. Out of the 16 million men in the States, there were only 400,000 women who served, and most of those were in Army or Air Force nurses, or in some administrative role. And I had finished the book. I thought it was great. I have October 24th, 1944. I have 24 chapters because I have 24 hours of the day. I thought this is a great parallel. And I have no women. And the book is at the publisher and it's going along. And I stumble on one more person. It happens to be a woman. And I said, stop the presses. I said, I have a woman. And they were very much accommodated this because this angle. I also mentioned Margaret Neubauer was in the Navy. She was a specialist And it's a little bit hazy what she was doing in the proving grounds, which is where a lot of more secretive work was going on. But she was a pigeoneer, and people say pigeoneer. And I'm reminded of a much earlier book when I investigated the job descriptions. In this case, it was the Army. When you went into the Army, there were 500 job descriptions that you, or specialties that you could be assigned to. Now, all those men going in wanting to be pilots, well, pilot was one of the 500. And when they felt they'd filled that category up, you got something else. So there were saddle makers. And I thought, saddle makers? I've got to meet a saddle maker. Somewhere I've got to find one. And then there were pigeoneers. And I said, I've got to find a pigeoneer. Well, it was 4 years later before I finally found a pigeoneer. So I said, Margaret Neubauer is going in this book. And truth be told, she was working in the pigeoneer group. There is an interview with one of the women who was in the pigeoneer group in the proving grounds as well. And unfortunately, she said, well, we women were trained to tend to the pigeons, but when they came back with the little tags on their legs, which held the secret message in the little tube, that was handled by the men. So there was still this little dichotomy, but that's okay. She was a pigeoneer, and even if she only tended to the pigeons. But a very sad story. Margaret, who was very well educated, came from a family of very talented people, and she was walking back to her barracks, and as we were talking before, was hit by a truck at 3 a.m. And there again, we know exactly when she died. She was taken to the hospital and did not survive. So, and these are 5 of the stories. There are some 30, 40 others in the book, and it is hard to say, how did you pick them? I think these spoke to me, but so did the other 30 or 40, and there's so many that go untold in the story. So we can go on to the next slide. There are, what I found, and obviously for 2,600 odd deaths to occur, they weren't just these one-offs.
Yeah.
There were 2 major incidents. One was the Princeton and the Birmingham, who were ships in the Pacific. And they had been involved in the landings at Leyte on the invasion of the Philippines on our return. And MacArthur's speech on the 20th, he landed in Leyte in his famous I Have Returned speech. And so, of course, the battles had been ongoing, but this was the day they landed and began moving inland to send troops from the ships inland to take over the airports and gain the ground. The ships were still out hovering around, either guarding convoys, bringing men, supplies into the Philippines. And the Princeton was just offshore when one of the Japanese torpedo planes, bombers, came over and dropped a bomb on the Princeton. It hit the deck and went through several levels, broke through as it fell through the decks in a sequence. And the Captain Burecker on the ship remembers saying when it happened, they looked at the hole and it was only 15 inches wide. And he said, well, I was thinking at the time that it was not such a big hole and would be okay. Well, it was okay until it got down to the hangar level where it exploded when it encountered the planes that were being loaded for fuel. The fuel caught fire in a massive explosion that you can see in the bottom left-hand picture. Well, ships came to the Princeton's aid, the Birmingham, and as well as several others, trying to help fight the fires. The Birmingham was there, and they actually told the other ships, we are better equipped, we're larger than you, we have more hoses, more men. If you can pull away and let us tie up to the Princeton and fight the fires. In the picture in the middle are the gentlemen who are fighting the fires, and this was about midday at this point. And many of the men on the Birmingham who weren't needed to handle the hoses had come up on the deck to watch. And so decks were crowded on both the Princeton and the Birmingham. when a secondary explosion occurred. And massive, again, explosion. They thought they had the fire out. You can see on the picture on the right bottom is the damage to the Birmingham when the second explosion occurred. And a massive number of men, I think in total the number was 330, died in this incident, mostly on the Birmingham, because the debris was flown up into the air and then came down, landed on the Birmingham, killing many, many people. This was the first incident where on the 24th, a number of ships had said that they were hit by a kamikaze. Now, they may not have not used the kamikaze word at first. They said a suicide bomber, or the plane had been, they watched.
Yeah, there's a debate in the sidebar right now about whether or it wasn't an official kamikaze, but it seems the Japanese were beginning to use this sort of solo suicidal, or at least not expecting to come out of an attack. But yeah, it's a day of a seems to become a policy change, a doctrine change, but for the Japanese, as things aren't going well for them.
Right, exactly. And I think it was the 30th before we actually declared such a thing as a kamikaze. But the crew, the captain said, "I'm sorry, this pilot was aiming for us. He might have been on fire and been hit himself, but he had every intention of doing damage." And so that was one of the ones that, besides these individual battles, that ratcheted up the numbers. And the next one is the Arasan Maru. If you'll go to the next slide. There are better pictures than the one in the middle of the Arasan Maru, but prettier pictures, I'll say. But this one looks as bad as the name that was given to them, which was the hell ships. And I say in the book, there's no record of who first coined the term hell ship and how the news got around. But the men in the Philippines, or really across Southeast Asia or South Pacific, knew what a hell ship was, knew that they were prison ships, knew that there were prisoners, whether they were Americans, British, Australians, who were put on them, who were very much abused on their trips. What happened when the Japanese knew that the Americans were coming back, and of course we landed on the 20th, as we were just talking about. They knew in spring, summer of that year, that they were in danger of the Americans returning. And Japan was, as you mentioned, realizing they were in not as, I guess, promising situation as they had been earlier in the war. And many of their industries at home were suffering from a lack of labor because their men had gone into the military. And so there were fewer and fewer people to help man the mines and the industries. So they said, well, we've got this trove of thousands of prisoners. And everyone knows about the Bataan Death March and the prisoners who were held in Camp Cabanatuan and O'Donnell in the thousands and dying by the thousands. And so they began to empty the prison camps. And they would go in and read off a list of 100 names and say, get ready to move, you're being transported back. Luckily not on a death march, but they were driven or carried back to, in this case, Manila, and not just on the Philippines, but elsewhere across the South Pacific. And they were boarded onto these ships. There were, July 42 is a Montevideo Maru, and that was shot or strafed and damaged, and we lost people on that one. But none of these other ships, there's actually no official account of how many. Those records were lost or destroyed or really not able to be reconstructed during the war. Not how many ships actually were considered hell ships, nor how many prisoners in total were transported on them. But the Arasan Maru was the worst case, and it happened on October 24th. They actually boarded 1,800 American prisoners on October 12th in Manila. And they were going to sail from Manila to Japan, taking the prisoners to the Japanese home islands. But they knew that the Americans were just offshore and they feared that they would be strafed or bombed. So they decided to sail not north to the Japanese home islands, but south to an island, Palawan, and kind of take cover in the coves and around there until they thought the danger was past. And sure enough, the Americans came. They actually didn't find the Arasan Maru for a few days. They did find them and strafed them, but nothing happened. And then at that point, the ship said, okay, all's clear. It seems to be a lull. They traveled back to Manila, waited for a convoy, and left Manila on the 20th. Now, this is from the 12th to the 20th, 8 days, where 1,800 men are incarcerated in the cargo holds, not allowed to come up on deck, except for a dozen or so who help prepare their meals. 1 cup of rice, 1 cup of water per day. And for latrines during this period, they had 5-gallon buckets that were at the front of the cargo hold where these men were held. If you were anywhere but the first 3 or 4 rungs of people, you were not going to make it to the latrines. Mm-hmm. So they're there for 8 days. The heat is over 100 degrees in the hold, and they were dying. There are, of course, no cell phone photos of this. There are artists rendering like the ones up top that try to give an idea of what went on. They were in the dark for the most part until unless a hatch was open for a man to go up and work on the food. And so it was absolutely miserable. People were going mad. They were, some were killing one another, not so much on the Arasan Maru, but on some of the other ships. A couple people tried to escape. The first one was Robert Lothrop, and there's a rendition of him on the bottom right trying to swim he jumped overboard and tried to swim away. And of course they shot him, brought his body back to the ship, threw it in the hold. And as people were dying, they were left in the holds with the living. So just incredibly miserable conditions. They were in the South Pacific, the East China Sea. On the 24th, they were making their way towards Japan when they were sunk by a submarine. We did not recognize, of course, none of these freighters, cargo ships had any identification that indicated that they were carrying prisoners, or no Red Crosses, no nothing, intentionally. And they were part of a convoy, and they were picked off as just another freighter. They were not the only one, as I mentioned earlier, Montevideo Maru back in July. And so they were sunk, and all 1,800 men went into the water. And if you can go to the next slide. I haven't had a hard time visualizing 1,800 men. And so I did this little graphic. Each one of these men is 10 men, and 180 here, so they're 1,800. You can see at the top left of the little map on the left, where the Arasan Maru was sunk after its detour to Palawan and then back north. So very much shy of Taiwan, where they were going. And when the 1,800 men went into the water or were killed in the explosion of the submarine, they treaded water. They did what they could. They looked for wood to stay afloat on. And as it turns out, there were 9 men who survived the night and managed to stay afloat. All rest of the 1,800 perished. And many of them actually didn't try to go into the water. Some couldn't swim, and so they stood on the deck until it went under, and the ship actually broke in half, and they went down with the ship. So these 9 men, 5 of them shown here, managed to find a raft, and it was a lifeboat. They got into the lifeboat, and lucky as men that they were, it had water on board and a mast. And one of the gentlemen had studied astronomy or navigation, and he was able to kind of reckon where China was. And of course, at the time, China was our ally. And they made for the Chinese shores and were picked up I think 20 miles from the shore. So it took them 3 more days to get there. And they were picked up by a friendly Chinese junk and taken back to the shore and to a U.S. compound, and eventually traveled some hundreds of miles with the aid of the Chinese and returned to the United States in December 1944. They were taken to the White House and feted and whatever, and they were told not to talk. Not to tell about their experience, not to tell about hell ships, not to tell about the 1,800 men. And a lot of people are like, well, how could that be? We couldn't silence them. Well, we did, and the newspapers were not to report it. Because the government felt, and probably rightly so, that our morale would have been so disrupted by hearing about the 1,800.
Yeah.
So it took months. Some families did not find out about their particular loved one until June or July of 45. And when by that time that was getting out into the papers, and these 5 men were then bombarded with requests. Did you know my son? Did you know my cousin, my brother, whatever? And so many people tried to find out about their loved ones through them. And they did as much as they could, obviously not knowing anywhere near the total number or who was on board. So with that, I've got one more slide, and I say in their honor, this is by no means the names of the 1,800. I think I could only fit, even to be legible, some 300 or so here. But it again helps me visualize the depth of this, of these people, and the numbers that were killed on this day. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions, talk about the 2,600 in a fashion you like.
Well, mesmerizing stuff. Thank you very much. I mean, my first question, I know what the answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's clearly you're interested in your writing and not just telling the stories from the point of view of them being in the past, but from the point of view of them being subjects that should be discussed today. I mean, you're talking about the incarceration of the Japanese when you mentioned the 442nd. You've talked about the hell ships, and there are still ongoing controversies. Isn't perhaps the right word, but there isn't enough recognition. Peter O'Connell made a comment in the sidebar of US subs are running out of targets by that point of the war. As a result, they were more likely to shoot first and ask questions later, and it was 21,000. American POWs and others went down on those hell ships. And it's something that even 80 years on, there's still a sensitivity about it. There's still a reluctance in some ways to admit some of this stuff there. So clearly you think it's important that we should be looking at these subjects and accepting that there's some blame on our side. There are things that are being covered up that shouldn't have been covered up. There was racism. So you obviously think that's important to have these discussions.
Absolutely. And I think that's why there are a couple aspects. And one I should mention on the RSM Maru, when you say about the submarines, protocol was when the submarines sunk a ship, foreign or enemy or ally, they were supposed to surface and look for survivors. That was part of their duty. Now, what you would have done, if you found 10 or 20 men in the water, that would be one thing. To find 1,800 men in the water would have been another. You're a submarine, there's no way you can rescue these people. But you could have called in the nearby ships, made some communication.
Yeah.
And of course, nothing was heard of the particular submarine who torpedoed the RSM Maru, because they themselves were lost in the battle, and or in the incident when they sank the RSM Maru. So we didn't even know this had occurred until much later, and when the survivors. So yes, we violated protocol, and I'm sure it wasn't the only time. That after a submarine would attack a ship, the enemy, if there was a convoy, the destroyers or guards for the convoy would have begun operations to sink our submarine, and so oftentimes they had to flee the scene without looking for survivors. And on the Japanese part, you could say, well, these 1,800 men, there were Japanese ships in the area that rescued their sailors from the RSM Maru and any other ships that went down. And they shot and beat at and refused to rescue the Americans or Australians or British, whatever nationality on the other ships. The same thing, though. You're right. I look at the George Washington Pittman's, his story. He needs to be told.
Yeah.
There's so many people like him. The accidents in the United States, people who were had a disease or spent their last days in a hospital because they got pneumonia or something that you just don't want to have happen. But yeah, I am very passionate about telling them those stories. And a lot of people say, well, my father was a P-38 pilot in World War II. He flew from North Africa, escorting bombers into Europe. And people say, well, why didn't you tell his story? When he survived, he was 97. And I talked to him at length. I said, well, what did you do? And he said, I didn't do anything special. And I said, I mean, you're a fighter pilot. You're shooting at people. People are shooting at you. How can you not have a story? And unfortunately, there are too many. My father, the pilot, my father, the tank commander, my father, this. And he just was as so many told me. It's harder and harder to talk to him, as you said earlier, these days. But to have them say anything more than I didn't really do anything. And I refuse. I always say, you have a story, and we're going to find something if I'm talking to them. But yeah, so many don't get recognized, and it's a shame. It's natural. I mean, how many stories do we know about Civil War or even World War One? And it will be so with World War II. I recognize that. But while there is history, and while we still know some people, and even now, people ask me can I help find out something about their parent? And I always say, absolutely. Send me a name. Goes for anybody on this video. Send me a name. I'll be happy to do what I can to find their story, because I believe in it.
And thank you for explaining that. I think it brings up this wider issue of, we're in an era where there is, people think I'm going off on a weird tangent, but there is this kind of stolen valor issue with people from different wars and people bigging up their stories. And I think I'm not condoning the people who do that, but I think us as the public are partly to blame for being excited more by the sexy stories and less excited by the more boring stories. And, we all think we want to meet the ranger who climbed the cliffs. We want to meet the commando who attacked from a canoe somewhere. But actually, the great majority of people who served their countries in World War II were doing something far more mundane, the tail behind, the shaft of the spear rather than the point of the spear.
Right.
And as you've made patently clear, the people at in the shaft of the spear are dying as well. They're dying in accidents. They're getting run over by trucks. They're having heart attacks. And as I said earlier, this sense that not everybody can be the hero running up the hill saving the day. As you've made it very clear, hundreds of people died in the bowels of an awful disease-ridden ship in terrible temperatures with nothing to eat, and we can't even imagine the situation in which they died. And then the irony of actually the torpedo that hits you has been fired by an Allied vessel. I mean, there are so many things that makes us feel uncomfortable when we read about it. But that's good. History shouldn't always be a warm, comfortable sweater. History should make us think and make us question it and make us feel bad, make us feel guilty in some ways for the tragedy that these men went through.
Yeah, but I agree. I think my goal in a way is if I can make myself feel just that much closer to what it looked like or felt like or sounded like or smelled like, I feel like I have some better recognition of it. And another, on a sort of a different side note, I often find, amazingly, for even 16 million Americans who fought, I've only interviewed, talked to, very, very small portion, but it's amazing the number who have a Patton or an Eisenhower encounter. And everyone always went, well, I did meet Patton, or well, I fought with Eisenhower. And I'll hear a story, dutifully take my notes, but then I kind of go back and say, let's make sure whether Eisenhower was really where you say he was.
Yeah, it's the dilemma of people spotting their relative in photos, and you go, it happened literally just last week. A friend of mine on Facebook has spotted her father in a photo, and those of us who are historians on it, we know that can't be your father. We know when that photo was taken. We know where your father was, and he wasn't there. And that awful guilt of telling someone you like, you're actually a bit wrong there, But this is the crossroads we're at in history, where as we said earlier, the people who were there have passed on, and their relatives are starting to misremember things, or they wrote down the wrong note, and they're looking things up, and they're trying to make these connections. They're trying to, Kevin Hemel, who writes about Patton, a number of times he's met Patton's driver. I mean, he's met hundreds of Patton. What they meant is they were driving a vehicle within Patton's Third Army. But in the telling within the family, they were literally driving a staff car with George sitting in the back seat there. And this is an interesting era, whereas historians, sometimes we have to be a bit blunt with people. Not blunt, but honest with them and say, something's happened in the way this story has been remembered, and then reminding them that whatever their relative actually did was really important, even if it wasn't, crewing a P-47 into Europe or jumping out with a parachute into Burma, whatever it would be. So so what next for you, Ron? What's your next project? Are you sticking with World War II, going another direction?
I think I'm too invested here to not continue. And people always say, "Oh, I can't imagine I can't think of anything I would write about." And I always go, "Oh my God, I can think of 100 new topics." And so it's really a matter of trying. I don't want to repeat history, and of course, at this time, it's almost impossible not to. But so that's part of it. Is even if you have an idea, it's drilling down and making sure that A, it really is a story worth telling. B, that there's enough research to substantiate it. Then of course taking on the research, or I thought when I began this book, about halfway through, when I discovered there actually is there are a couple books on the Arasan Maru, and one on October 24th, which I didn't find until I was halfway through, and I was close to being suicidal. But I read that book, and it is about October 24th, but it is from a much different approach. It's more at the FDR, Churchill level than it is at the individual stories. So I felt it was okay to keep going. And so you not only look for the topic, but has it been done before? Has this person's story told before? Do I have, and if it has, do I have anything to add? Because if you don't, it's not worth the years it takes to research it and move forward.
Well, I think the very fact that you found this novel approach to writing about it is good, because we have this occasional How to Be a Historian series on the channel where people talk about the different roads of getting in. And people often say, well, there's something interesting, but as you say, I don't know that I can say anything new about it. But you just haven't found the angle yet. So rather than writing about a ship, rather than writing about a particular theater on a certain day, as you've done, what about a certain date? What about the participants from a certain town who went, that's what my friend Autumn is doing with her book about these people from her town on the East Coast. She's looking at the people who were from her area and what they were doing. So there's always an angle. You've just got to find it. But just to give you some representative views from the viewers there. So David is saying Rona's research is simply brilliant. She really did her homework to bring us these stories. Abraham will rewatch this presentation. Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. This has been outstanding from William there. So people have appreciated the unusual angle from which you approach this, but yet fascinating. So it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, Rona. So again, I'll hold up my copy of the books, folks. So it's the old cliche. It's a book with something for everyone. There's every corner of the globe. All services, all racial backgrounds, all ages. I'm guessing. What's the oldest? Do you remember off the top of your head who was the oldest person to die that day? Is that?
Oh dear! Now there's a book.
Yeah.
People to die. Most of, by far, these were young people. But in terms of sheer numbers, and since I wasn't doing admirals and generals, they were 30s, 40s. I think George McElroy, he'd been in World War I, so he was, I think he was like 45, something like that.
Yeah. So going to be up at the higher end, yeah. No, but it's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to look forward to inviting an occasion to bring you back a second time. That'll be really fantastic, folks.
Thanks.
In the meantime, I'm back again. A rare weekend show. We're talking about the last surviving German veterans and what they had to say of the Wehrmacht about their experiences tomorrow with Christian. Then I'm off on Sunday. Then Monday, Mark Stilley's coming on talking about Midway, and then I've got a few days break where I'm going off to England, and then we're carrying on all through the Christmas spirit. Dr. Phil Blood is going to be coming on the 29th. Talking about the Nazis and occultism, which will be interesting, kind of a Christmas show there, so a slightly bizarre topic. But in the meantime, as always, don't forget to buy my guest books, check out their websites, consider supporting me via Patreon or YouTube channel membership, and above all, keep sharing what we're doing with your friends. But cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Friday. Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.